my house to yours. Welcome to EMS and The Economist. I am once again joined by Shawn DuBravac, first EMS and The Economist of the year. Happy New Year, Shawn. How are you?
Good to see you, Phil. It's great to be here.
Good stuff. I'm going to start with the elephant in the room before we get on to some of the book to bills and such, but obviously they're impacted as well. Um, the new Trump presidency, tariffs coming in this weekend on close neighbors, Canada, Mexico, a lower tariff coming in on China than on those two countries. What are you seeing as the impact of that? Are you seeing a panic? I think a lot of people are surprised how quickly and how aggressively things are happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that we anticipated tariffs. President Trump, leading up to the inauguration, talked about tariffs being the most beautiful word. He had this like quote where he just thought tariffs were great.
Mm.
They, some of his first actions in office were renaming things. Gulf of Mexico is renamed Gulf of America for those of us in the U.S. Obviously, it'll stay Gulf of Mexico probably for the rest of the world, but here in the U.S. now it's
Yeah.
Gulf of America. Denali, which is the tallest peak in North America, which is in Alaska, was renamed back to Mount McKinley. And in that release, they talked about, McKinley had implemented tariffs and what a great job that was. So,
Okay.
and for me, it really solidified when I saw the tat that was developing with Colombia. President Trump and the administration tried to send back
Yeah.
some Colombian citizens who were in the U.S. illegally. They sent them on military transport. The Colombian government would not accept them because they weren't coming in as on civilian aircraft, and so
Mm.
said we won't accept them. And President Trump immediately came out and said put 25% tariffs on them. So it feels like it is the easy button sitting there on the desk that
Mm.
when anything, if any disagreement erupts, if there's any issue, they're turning immediately to tariffs and pushing the
Mm.
tariff buttons. Now, Colombia backed away from that, so the U.S. backed away from that, but it was looking
Yeah.
like we were rushing quickly into a trade war there. I think there was always a lot of debate about where the circle was going to be driven around, the tariffs, whether it was going to be tightly around the U.S. border or whether it was going to
Mm.
be, the way
North
it looks
America.
more
Yeah.
today around the North America border. And Trump in his last administration did rewrite some of the things in NAFTA at the time, becoming USMCA. A lot of things didn't change too much. The at least the ability to move most
Yeah.
goods in without tariff remain in place, but it does look like that is going to change. And as we're recording this on Friday, it looks
Yeah.
like we will get an announcement here probably in the next hour. The anticipation is that those tariffs will go into place on March 1. So the next month will
Okay.
be a lot of negotiating around those
Mm.
tariffs, but it does appear that President Trump believes deeply in tariffs. He believes that they'll be beneficial for the U.S. and that he is prepared to implement them everywhere. If he's going to
Yeah.
implement tariffs with Canada and Mexico, then no country is off the tables.
Yeah, no, it's surprising and it's happening faster than people expect. Interesting that there's kind of another month where they've got some negotiation space, but also so people can get all their ducks in a row. I noticed on the December PCB figures there was a huge jump, and I guess that was people getting stuff in ahead of the tariffs. Has have you seen a big impact of that in terms of trade with both the EMS and the PCB industry?
We definitely, if you look more broadly, you definitely saw imports strong in December.
Mm.
Intermodal traffic, cargo coming in, train traffic, moving that deeper into the country because it arrives in the ports, and then we often are putting it onto trains and running it in. December saw record months. If you look at the order flow, so the bookings for PCB and EMS both were outside of the normal distribution we would have expected for
Yeah.
December. In fact, with PCBs, you're like in the 99th percentile. So I think that's there's a definitely what I'm hearing is lots of quoting taking place, lots of people looking at getting those orders and shipments into the country quickly, as much as some of those are brokered boards and other things like
Yeah.
that. And so you want to get that into the country before the tariffs went into
Yeah.
place. My sense is that we have December data, but my sense is that didn't slow down in January at all. So I would expect the same thing to happen in January, and even probably a pickup in February if it's possible, just to get ahead of any potential tariffs that might go into place on March 1. So you're seeing it
Yeah.
not just in the electronics industry, you're really seeing it across the board. I think every industry is trying to pull forward as much as they can, and
Yeah.
I think the electronics industry is following suit.
Yeah, and that's a strange phenomenon because we kind of ended last year with figures in the year that implied the inventory bubble that was in EMS with respect to components had pushed through into a finished goods inventory bubble with a lot of the OEMs, and the order books were slowing down. And this is kind of counter to that. So it really is dominating the trends at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is definitely dominating the trends, and I think the big question is, what happens? And there's so much
Mm,
uncertainty. You saw the Federal Reserve this week say, "Hey, we're going to take a really a wait and see approach," because I think they're not sure what implications the tariffs have, if they'll be inflationary, if they'll cause demand to slow significantly, and then we'll see unemployment start to rise and the labor market,
mm,
deteriorates. Right now, though, things look really strong. So the
mm.
U.S. economy, I think, is in a position of strength right now, and
Yeah,
perhaps President Trump is trying to take advantage of that position of strength, and thinks that the U.S. can implement these tariffs earlier than others, more aggressively than others, and that
mm,
that will be the beneficiaries, of them,
yeah,
and that other countries aren't in a position of strength and of negotiations. But uh, we know that things can change quickly, and that economic periods of economic growth don't typically die of old age. They're typically
yeah.
destroyed by some policy blunder or some
Incident. Yeah,
mistake, whether it's
yeah.
on the monetary side or the fiscal side. And so I think while the U.S. economy looks strong right now, and we just got GDP numbers for the fourth quarter, that looked good. 2024 was strong, even
Mm.
though interest rates, were
Well, hi.
still high. Um, but whether that growth continues, I think it really is now uh, in more question than it was a month or two ago.
Yeah, I think Trump presidency 2.0, the subtitle is anything could happen. So we're kind of in that position. And I think when you look at we talked a lot in the past about the impact of tariffs and who pays for them and how that operates. And I think when you look specifically at Mexico, but also at Canada, where a lot of products in their supply chain do move back and forth across the border, it's really complicated and really difficult to actually calculate what those tariffs are. So there are some big challenges in terms of just logistics. I know there are plenty of companies that are looking at their footprint and looking at where they're buying their contract manufacturing from, and they're taking a wait and see approach on that and wondering about that. And it feels almost like what you've got in the US is the application of a purchase tax that where US goods are exempt. So it almost feels like everything outside has a, 10, 15, 25% additional purchase tax, and everything inside is purchase tax free in this particular instance. Do you think that's enough of a delta to push people towards US goods, or do you think a lot of US goods like, pickup trucks or whatever else come across the border so many times that actually that will be inflationary on those things?
I mean, I do think it'll be inflationary across the board. It's hard to imagine that some of these things won't be inflationary.
Mm,
If you look back at 2017, when we saw tariffs get put in place initially under uh, President Trump in his first term, we didn't really see the import prices declining. So you're not seeing the importers really cut their prices. The prices are the tariffs are being added on to the existing cost structure. I mean, maybe there's some absorption a little bit in the supply chain, but it does look like those things are getting passed on. And so as a result, it's hard to imagine that some of these things aren't inflationary. And if these end up being across the board tariffs, there's food that's imported, there's building
Mm,
materials that are imported. Tighter immigration probably means that labor costs are tighter for certain segments of
mm,
areas that are benefit from immigration. So you think about hospitality, you think again about construction or building, and so
yeah,
it's hard to imagine that we don't see inflationary pressure in some of those pockets. I think the other challenge is we've seen a lot of investment in manufacturing capacity, and especially in electronics manufacturing
mm,
capacity here in the US. Some of that is from manufacturers outside the US who are trying to set up facilities and plants
yeah,
in the US to take advantage of the growth that we have here. And so
yeah,
if you've got uncertainty around the growth, then they may not be as willing to make some of those investments in plant equipment. So it isn't
yeah,
just that they're this idea that, oh, we'll have tariffs in place and so people will start to build plants and facilities in that country. I'm not sure that necessarily will be the case if the growth in that country, in this case the US, isn't robust and warrants that. So
yeah,
I do think there's a lot of dynamics there. I think the other thing is that some of these countries may start to try to decouple from the US as much as the US has worked to decouple from China. You could see some countries decoupling from the US and looking to expand markets elsewhere. So you've
yeah,
seen a lot of foreign direct investment coming into Mexico. You've seen China and others investing in Mexico, and maybe Mexico starts to make better ties with Europe, and they look
yeah,
to export goods to Europe as opposed to the US. So a lot of things could shift if there's a feeling that these tariffs are going to be impactful and that they're going to be permanent. If
yeah,
there's a feeling that they'll be permanent, then but regardless, I think all of the uncertainty that we feel now and that we see now will cause hesitation from companies that are making investments. I think they'll pull forward imports as much as they can, but I think making other investments, they will take a little bit of a longer wait and see approach, because when they're deploying capital in things like plants and new facilities, those are long-term investments. And I don't
yeah.
think that they want to be tied to those long-term investments if it isn't going to be conducive for the long run.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like risk is the big factor there that people are concerned about, and they see it everywhere from many different points of view. So it's managing that and trying to mitigate that, and I think that's the underlying concern of EMS leadership. Excuse me, as they go into 2025, that concern over geopolitics, over hot wars, over tariffs and trade wars, all those different things are playing most heavily on their mind, where where they would like to be able to make longer term decisions. They're in a bit of a short term mode now, whilst they consider those things. That was the discussion at Electronica. There was a lot of discussion around that with manufacturing companies around CES. I don't know whether you got to CES or you were able to observe what was going on there. Any big takeaways from that show? As I've said in the past, you were normally my go-to guy at CES for trends at the very start of the show. What did you see there this year?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of trends that speak to global manufacturing, and I think the one dynamic that's a little different right now is that the US economy in particular, but the global economy is holding up pretty well. And so
Mm,
when you are an EMS company, you want to be cautious, and you're probably trying to understand all of the uncertainty, and at the same time you're getting orders, at least for right
yeah,
now. Like, you're seeing
yeah,
demand, so you're trying to respond to demand. At the same time, you're trying to reconfigure things. I mean, I think if you look at some of the announcements we saw at CS in the beginning of the year, the auto sector is definitely pushing full steam ahead towards
yeah,
autonomous vehicles, and you saw companies like Waymo and others touting how many self-driving rides they're giving every week and how many
Yeah.
miles they're covering. I think they uh, just hit some pretty major milestones in their journey, and they're expanding. You saw a number of Chinese EV companies exhibiting there, including companies like Zeekr that are supporting Waymo with a self-driving vehicle that will be custom built for them. And so you do see a big push towards autonomy. You continue to see a big push towards EV vehicles, even though maybe the momentum has slowed a little bit in the US, and obviously this administration is not making that transition a priority. It still
Mm.
is a priority in other markets, especially markets
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
higher fuel costs. You think of look at places like Australia where you have seen Chinese companies make significant
Yeah,
inroads and significant
absolutely.
pushes towards EVs. So there's a lot happening there. Europe, obviously, as well as has had that as for a priority for a long time. So that was a big piece. AI was the underlying theme
Of
everywhere.
course.
Like everything's
Yeah.
becoming software defined, and so I think the role that partnerships play become important. It isn't just manufacturing a black box and shipping it out the door, but it's tying in intelligence and other things to it to make it connect and useful to a broader ecosystem of products.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's becoming more and more of an auto show, and I think it is doing a better and better job of that. There were big announcements from BYD and various different companies. And down here in Australia, you're absolutely right. BYD have made incredible leaps. You see so many of them on the road now. It's impressive, and they've just brought out a ute or a truck here, which
Mm.
seems to be incredibly popular and doesn't look like a Chinese vehicle at all. So yeah, it is fascinating. So sentiment reports, book to bills out recently. I guess a lot of, as we've said already, a lot of executives are in a bit of a wait and see mode. What do you see as their underlying feeling for 2025? Is it that optimism in the market because maybe the economy does feel like it's turning in the right direction, even though I think for Europe there's a sense that that will be somewhat delayed. Is it that mixed with the risk and the unknown of a new presidency?
Yeah, and I do think the headwinds are different in Europe than they are in
Mm,
in the U.S. And obviously I think they have much stiffer headwinds in Europe than
mm.
we're seeing in the U.S. But when you and the obviously IPC's sentiment metrics capture global sentiment, so we're looking not
Yeah.
just at U.S. manufacturers and U.S. companies, but broadly. What's been most interesting to me is that you really did see sentiment decline and decay during the fall. As we were moving into the
Mm.
fall, manufacturers and the rest of the supply chain were feeling a lot less optimistic about the current situation. They were still pretty optimistic about the outlook. If we ask not only how are things today, but how are things going to be over the next year, and there was a pretty strong divergence between what they were feeling today versus what they were anticipating over the next year. As we've moved into the new year, December, January, things have started to pick back up. So
Okay.
sentiment is looking a little bit better than it was, but the trend into the fall was definitely decay. We're definitely seeing things weaken across the board, and now you're seeing a little bit of that recover. Some of that probably motivated by the strength that we saw in December, which I presume is probably carrying on with what we'll see in January when that settles.
Yeah.
Sentiment was looking pretty good for January, so I I anticipate that at at least the beginning of the year things start off on a pretty good note, and we'll see
Yeah.
if the uncertainty really starts to weigh on sentiment. We'll publish the next sentiment report here in the next 15 days or so, and I think that will be the first glimpse of how
Yeah.
some of this uncertainty is impacting the outlook.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, I think everybody is looking forward to getting the first 30 days of the new presidency behind them, but getting to that 100-day point where maybe it feels like by that point we've got clarity. I like your reference of the tariff button. It does feel like that's the nuclear button for this particular administration, and if they want people to pay attention, they press the button, and stuff happens, and it's a great way of getting attention. So it's to a degree, it's doing the job there.
Yeah,
Next
and I
month,
think
we'll probably.
well,
Sorry,
and I
go
was just
ahead.
going to say, I think a lot of things have to happen in 2025. If you
Mm,
look, most U.S. presidents lose seats in both the House and the Senate in their midterm election.
mm,
So President Trump enters this term as a lame duck president,
yeah,
as what we would call lame duck president. This will be his final term because he's limited to just two
yeah.
terms. And so, presumably, unless something else changes,
Well,
this
absolutely.
will be the last one. And in 2 years, we'll have what we call the midterm elections. And the midterm elections, on average, the president is losing 30 seats in the House, losing 6 seats in the Senate. We've seen a number of presidents over the last 40 years lose control over the House or the Senate as a result of that during their midterm. Even Ronald Reagan, who did phenomenally well in the '84
Mm,
election, lost significant seats and the majority in the Senate in his midterm election. So my anticipation is that President Trump, just following what we've seen over the last 40 years,
yeah.
will lose seats in both the House and the Senate. He'll lose control over both the House and the Senate, and so his last 2 years, I think, will be much more difficult than where he is today. And so I think there is this motivation to really get things passed in this first year, because
Mm,
even as we go into next year, a lot of senators and Congress, uh, you know, will have to start working on that next election. They'll start
yeah,
to campaign. They'll have to make sure their
yeah,
votes are aligned so that they can get reelected. And
yeah.
so, I think the headwinds get much harder for any big things to happen next year. So I think there's a lot of motivation to get things done. It isn't just that it's jump out the gate first 100 days, but it's also
Yeah.
this realization that things could get really tough to get anything at all passed in the next 2 years.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that early activity, that early flurry of activity is really important, and it's part of second presidency is always a bit of legacy building as well. So big actions, big sweeping actions often occur, and they're thinking about the impact of those actions, and how those actions will be remembered, and how potentially they're changing the country, not just internally, but its impression globally. So really interesting times ahead there, Shawn. Let's talk again, probably over the same channels at the beginning of March, but we'll definitely see each other in Los Angeles for Apex in mid-March. So I look forward to that. And thanks so much for your time, as always.
Yeah, always great to join you, Phil.